Okay, I think let's start this breaking news. This will be a presentation by Felipe Murgas on detection or discovery of a planet candidate transiting a white dwarf, who was Felipe and several others at IAC were members in a team that published this work very recently in Nature. Felipe himself, he is originally from Chile. He made his master's thesis at the University of Chile and then his PhD here at IAC under the supervision of Enrique Payet and Eduardo Martin, which he finished in 2013. And then he went to a postdoc in the University of Grenoble under Javier Bonfils and has returned to IAC about 3 years ago as a postdoc who is working with the exoplanet team, of course, and also for the LCO, Las Cumbres Observatory. So, in the Qatar Exoplanet Survey. So, Felipe, please go ahead and tell us about this new discovery here.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity to talk about this. It's been an exciting couple of weeks with the announcement of phosphine in Venus, the hot Neptune that was discovered last week, and also it was announced this recent discovery about a giant planet candidate transiting a white dwarf. So before I start, I want to do a couple of disclaimers. So this will be closer to a journal club. So we will be discussing the paper by Andrew Vanderburg and collaborators, which I am included, and also Enrique Payet and Hannu Parviainen, as part of the team that helped in the discovery of this new object. And a second disclaimer that I want to do is that I'm not an expert in white dwarf or post-common envelope binary star. My main work has been always transiting planets around main sequence stars. So if you see me saying something that is wrong about white dwarfs or post-common envelope binaries, please correct me at the end of the talk during the session, the question session. So I'm going to start with a brief introduction. As you may know, the planets are linked to their star since their formation and evolution and end of life cycle of their star. All of these affect the planets. So far we have evidence of planet formation along star formation in the form of disks. Most of the planets are detected around main sequence stars, which is the main focus of most of the exoplanet field. We have detected a couple of planets orbiting around giant stars. These are more difficult planets to detect due to the stellar variability and well, basically because of the technique used to discover exoplanets. Detecting planets around giant stars is much more difficult. But one of the questions that we have in the field is what is the fate of the planets in a planetary system at the end of their star's life cycle? So I'll start with the high mass example, high mass stars. So far, we don't have planets around the black holes discovered so far, but we have the next best thing. We have discovered objects orbiting around neutron stars, pulsars, using the pulsar timing variation technique, basically measuring the time of arrival of the pulsar signal and try to detect an offset in the timing. And we can infer the presence of massive objects around these pulsars. I said objects because if you look at the list of current pulsar I'm going to say planets. Some of them have masses bigger than what we consider a planet, bigger than 14 Jupiter mass. So there are a couple of brown dwarfs that has been discovered orbiting around pulsars. Now, these are rare. They're not very common. Of the 4,000 and more planets that we have discovered so far, we only have 17 of these types of objects. And the formation of these objects, it's still being discussed, but the possible formation mechanism that I put here in a paper by Rebecca Martin and collaborators is basically that these objects are second generation planets. And that's rare because you probably need a couple of conditions that not all the stars fulfill. For example, they need to be in a binary system. So the supernova explosion destroys a low mass companion star. And with the remnant from this companion star, a disk is formed, and then it undergoes again planet formation in this disk. So the two conditions that need to happen is that the original star is in a binary system. It destroys a companion, and then the disk is not destroyed by the initial radiation of the pulsar. It's not disrupted by the pulsar radiation, and planets are formed there. So these are most of the rocky planets found around pulsars. It's believed to be second generation planets. About the most massive objects, I don't know how they could survive the supernova explosion. So the question that we have is, what about low mass? And by low mass, I mean sun-like stars. So I'm going to start from a theoretical point of view. What is the future of our solar system, or what we think will happen? So there is this paper by Schroeder and Connor Smith in 2008. They model all the red giant phase of the sun, and they try to see what will happen to the inner planets, most specifically to the Earth. So you have to model the mass loss by this giant phase, and also how it affects the planets with the dynamical drag of the envelope that is being expelled, how it affects the planet, angular momentum exchange. And so you have to consider a lot of things. So most of the inner planets are affected by tidal forces, and eventually, according to these simulations, Mercury, Venus, and also the Earth, they get engulfed by the star. And in this paper, they claim that planets with orbit starting in a radius of 1.5 astronomical units, they could survive, but the Earth, according to these models, doesn't. So, but don't worry, this will be the end of the Earth, but life will be extinct before that because of the high luminosity of the sun. So don't get too sad. Life will be dead long before that. So what happens with the external planets? So there is another, all the planets are basically affected by this, by the giant phase of the sun. So there is this paper by Think et al. 2020 that they did the N-body simulations and see what happens also to the outer planets in this giant phase of the sun. All the orbits expand. Basically, they move, and in these simulations, Jupiter and Saturn enter a 5-2 resonance, orbital resonance. But eventually, and I'm talking about really long scales of time, of the order of 10 gigayears, planets become susceptible to the external planets. They become susceptible to be disrupted by close-in encounters by other stars. So if you look at the theory, you think that, okay, the sun as a white dwarf will probably be alone. All the inner planets will be engulfed by the sun. And eventually, in really long scales of time, maybe no outer planets. So if you only know this, you could think that, okay, so white dwarfs, they shouldn't, if you try to extrapolate, maybe it's really hard to find evidence of planets around white dwarfs. But there is evidence about of planets or remnant of planetary systems around white dwarfs. So I'm pointing some examples here. These are not all the examples of evidence, but but I'm only naming a few. So most of the evidence comes from infrared excess in white dwarfs that could can be caused by rings of dust around these stellar remnants. Also, we have transits from debris orbiting around the white dwarf WD 1145. And last year, a paper by Gansike et al. They have evidence of a gaseous disk around WD 0914 that this could be coming from a giant planet. The evidence was interpreted of coming from a giant planet orbiting this white dwarf. So as a summary, most of the evidence came from contamination of heavy metals, basically in the surface of white dwarfs. Basically, we were finding things that are not typical in white dwarfs. And also the transited objects around WD 1145. Here I'm showing an example of these transits of this debris disk. This is on the left, the discovery paper by Vanderburg and collaborators in 2015 using K2 data. So you can see that there is a periodicity, and sometimes the debris disk is opaque enough to produce a transit, but in other occasions it's not. So this also has been observed by GTC in the paper by Izquierdo and collaborators 2018 using GTC Osiris. One of these transits was observed. You can see that they are asymmetric and irregular because it's not a solid object. It's just a summary of a lot of small transiting objects, and you can use color information to determine the grain size that is producing the transit. But that was pretty much all the observational evidence for white dwarfs, and until TESS arrived. So you probably heard of TESS. TESS is the successor of Kepler and K2 missions. It's basically a space telescope dedicated to find transiting planets. It was launched in 2018 with a nominal 2-year mission. Currently, it's in extended vision. And it has 4 cameras with a wide field of view of several degrees. And unlike Kepler, that was looking for a couple of years to the same part of the sky, this is an all sky survey. Now, the survey is done by observing this striped big part of the sky for 27 days of continuous monitoring. So TESS was observing sector 14 last year in July and August. So the pipeline that the TESS team have, they usually analyze the 27 data. This is an example in the top panel. It's basically two chunks of 13 days. And then it sends the data to the Earth, and it observes again for another 13 days. So after it got analyzed by the pipeline, initially it was detected the transit, but I think it was rejected because that star is not a main sequence star. It was cataloged as not main sequence. And also the transit was too deep. So these are the transits detected in this white dwarf, right? Now, Andrew Vanderburg was doing a visual inspection of transit of possible transits around white dwarfs, and they caught this object. Now, these are initial results from the TESS pipeline. You can see that they have a period of 1.4 days. And at the beginning, they have a radius ratio of the planetary radius and the star radius of 2. So it was probably a transiting object around a really small star. So if you phase folded the initial Kepler, the initial TESS data, you could detect this transit, and you can see that it was really deep. And also one of the key key hints that the transit was happening around a white dwarf was the duration. The duration was of about only 8 minutes. So okay, so you have the TESS data, but that's not the final conclusion that you have a transiting object. You need to validate this object. So you can see here the image of TESS. This is what TESS see. You can see that the angular resolution is really poor. So the transit could be happening in a nearby star and not actually in the white dwarf identified as 1856. So what you do is you usually check using telescopes that have a higher angular resolution, mostly from the ground. So this is what Andrew Vanderburg did. They check using that the transit occurred in the star that was cataloged as a white dwarf, and using 2 private telescopes, and they found that yes, the transit was occurring in the position of the white dwarf. So then you check if there is any background star causing the transit, and for that you go to old images. For example, this one from 1952, and you mark the current position of the star, and you see that is an empty field. So they got really interested in this white dwarf because, well, the transits were occurring in the white dwarf. Now, the white dwarf 1856 is fairly faint, as you may think. Well, faint for exoplanet work. It's Sloan G magnitude 17. And you can see that this is from the discovery paper of this object. You can see that the star is basically a black body. It doesn't have any strong absorption or emission lines. And using the spectrum, Vanderburg and collaborators, they estimated a mass for the white dwarf of half the mass of the sun, basically, and a radius of 40% bigger than the Earth. And it's really cool. It's really cool. It's a really cool object. It has an effective temperature of 4,700 Kelvin. So using models of cooling of white dwarfs, the estimated age of this white dwarf is 4.9 gigayears. So that means that it's been as a white dwarf for 4.9 gigayears. So since they were pretty sure that the transit, they were really confident that the transit was coming from the white dwarf, what they really needed was a really high temporal resolution transit observation, because the transit is only 8 minutes. So they really wanted to get as much points as they could during a transit with really high precision to measure the radius ratio of the transit depth, basically. Luckily, we here have a target of opportunity program for interesting test objects. So Vanderburg contact us to see if we could observe with GTC or another telescope this object. So we did just that using the target of opportunity program for tests that we have. Now, we decided to use Osiris in imaging mode. We decided to use a filter close to the test band, which was Sloan G. But since we required the highest temporal resolution we could get, we decided to use the non-standard frame transfer mode in a transit that was going to occur the 22nd of October of last year. So we chose an exposure time of 10 seconds, and using the frame transfer mode, while it was exposing, the GTC CCD was reading. So that allowed us to have almost a continuous observation of the transit. The total duration of the observations were of only 70 minutes, so a little bit more than 1 hour. So now what I'm showing here is the GTC Osiris. I call it the raw light curve. So this is just when you take the radius ratio of the white dwarf, which I pointed here, and a couple of reference stars. So this is only the flux ratio of the target, which is the white dwarf, and a couple of reference stars. So this is just the flux ratio. I haven't done any detrending. You can still improve this light curve. And what I wanted to see here is that the transit is really deep. It's actually 50% of decrease in the flux of the white dwarf. So I thought that maybe a 50% you could see it in the you could actually see it in these frame images, but I don't know. I'm not sure. I think I see it in the ingress more or less, but there are a lot of seam variations and even a satellite cross by, if you can see it. But I think I see it at the ingress. I'm not really sure. It's really hard to tell using only this animation. But anyway, this really high quality light curve that we were able to get with GTC was really helpful in the mass estimation of this object that I will talk about soon. But we didn't only use also GTC. We also we have time with the instrument Muscat 2, the Carlos Sanchez telescope, which is a multi-band imager, and it can take simultaneous measurements using 4 CCDs, basically, with a really short exposure time. So this is the same transit observed by a 1.5 meter telescope. Of course, the data here is VIN, and you can see an initial transit fit that Hanu performed. So besides the 1 band that we could deliver, we also have 4 extra bands taken with a smaller telescope of the same transit. So using this GTC transit and some Spitzer data that I will show later, plus the transits taken by other facilities like Muscat 2, you can deliver several parameters of doing a transit fit. So as I said before, the transit duration was 8 minutes, and the separation between the star and the transiting object is 0.02 astronomical units. Now this is a grazing transit. That means that we are not perfectly aligned. So that's why you have only a 50% decrease in the flux of the white dwarf. If we were perfectly aligned, since this transiting object is basically of the size of Jupiter, and the white dwarf is roughly the size of the Earth, we would have 100% decrease in the flux. The star would disappear. So we knew that the transiting object was roughly of the same size as Jupiter, but we cannot estimate directly the mass from that because, as you know, something of the size of Jupiter can have the mass of a planet or the mass of a really low mass star passing through brown dwarfs. So it's really hard to detect that and to estimate the mass based only on the transit. Now, if you notice before in the spectrum of the white dwarf doesn't have any lines, so it was impossible to use radial velocities to estimate the mass of the object. So what we did was the next best thing, I guess, which is to compare the optical observations from GTC compared with infrared Spitzer observations of this transiting object. Now, planets, when they form, they contract, and also so they emit in the infrared. The same thing goes for brown dwarfs. They get cool in time, but they emit a little bit of the infrared. So if you can compare the transit depth in the optical compared to the transit depth in the infrared, if there is a difference, that means there is some emission, and that depends of the mass. So as you can see here, basically the GTC data compared to the Spitzer data, they are pretty much the same. So that means that you can rule out several masses. So And this is one of the plots of the discovery paper. All the gray area is basically all the masses that are ruled out based on this approach of comparing the transit depth in the optical and the infrared. Now, of course, it will depend. As you say before, planets and brown dwarf, they get cool. They cool in time. So it depends of the age of the system if there is infrared emission or not. But anyway, yeah, a mass of 13.8 Jupiter masses is ruled out regardless of the age of the system with 95% confidence. So that is basically the upper limit in what we consider a planet. Now, based on the motions of the system, probably this white dwarf probably belongs to the thin disk. So that put an upper limit in the age of the system of 10 gigayears. So if the age of the system is less than 10 gigayears, then the mass of the transiting object is less than 11.5 Jupiter masses with 95% confidence. So that means that it's highly likely that this is indeed a giant planet and not a brown dwarf. Now, you still have a 5% chance that there is a brown dwarf. So what if this is a transiting brown dwarf? So if that is the case, it will be the really odd pair of white dwarf brown dwarf transiting pair. Based on this paper by Nelson and collaborators that have more or less 20 pre-cataclysmic binary stars, so a white dwarf plus a Loma star or a brown dwarf orbiting around each other, it will be the system with the longest orbital period. So you can see here, this is the orbital period in minutes of 20 systems of white dwarfs plus something else orbiting. And they go from a couple of 1 hour to a couple of hours. Usually those are the typical orbital period. And also it will have the lowest mass. We know that it has a mass of lower than 13.8 Jupiter masses. So this will be also mean that it is the lowest mass brown dwarf transiting a white dwarf. So this builds the case that what we have is highly likely a giant planet. Now, as I showed before in all the simulations, that all the planets get either engulfed by the star or pushed away during the red giant phase. So how did it get to an orbit so close to the star, to 0.02 astronomical units? So if you look at the post-common envelope evolution of basically binary or binary stars, so you have that the companion is engulfed in the atmosphere that is shredding in the giant phase. Now you also have a lot of complicated interactions between the star and the atmosphere of the giant. So you have tidal forces and also some dynamical drag. So, and at the same time, you are eliminating the atmosphere of the giant. It's going away. So the common theory is that the orbit of the companion shrinks and the common envelope gets expelled, basically. And after it doesn't have, the companion is not inside the atmosphere of the giant. After all the atmosphere of the giant is expelled, the orbital decay stops. But with a mass so low for the companion to this white dwarf, it's not possible with this mass to dissipate the atmosphere of the giant. So what would probably happen is that maybe there were more planets in the system. This is the current idea. And this giant planet interacted with the other planets in the system when the star was in the giant phase. probably it ended up in a more eccentric orbit, and with time it got circularized and it's in the current position. But the important thing is that it's probably a planet. It's not 100% sure, but comparing with the thermal emission evidence and also the what we know of this binary system, it's probably a planet. What is the consequence of that for exoplanet research? Well, this is more what my work, what I like to do. So it's to try to detect atmosphere of exoplanets around any star. But there was this paper accompanying the publication by Vanderburg and collaborators about what will happen if we have a rocky planet transiting a white dwarf, and to see if we could detect the atmosphere of an Earth-sized planet using James Webb Space Telescope. Now, of course, we have a lot of rocky planets in the habitable zone orbiting around M dwarfs. So with James Webb, we could detect some molecules like carbon dioxide or water, but you need a lot of transit to build the signal to detect these molecules. So with the best candidates we have so far, you will need 10 transits to detect these molecules. And if they have life or an atmosphere close to what we have on Earth, James Webb probably won't have enough time to build the signal to detect these signatures. Now we only have one giant planet candidate orbiting a white dwarf, and the probability of finding an Earth-sized planet in the habitable zone of a white dwarf is not very well constrained. It's less than 28% according to this paper of 2018 that I mentioned here, based on Kepler and K2 data. But there are some advantages. I know that maybe you won't think of white dwarfs as a place to find probably life, but the white dwarfs, they can offer stable conditions due to their long cooling times. Also, they don't have as many stellar spots as M dwarf, so maybe detecting signatures there in the atmosphere using transits is more easy. And the small radii of the white dwarfs is extremely favorable to planetary atmospheric characterization using transits. Now, what Lisa Kaltenegger did in this paper was just put an Earth-like or Earth-sized planet around the WD 1856, around this white dwarf that has this giant planet candidate. What I mean by Earth-like is one mass of the Earth, one radii of the Earth, and put it in the habitable zone, basically receiving the same flux as the Earth does now. If you put it if you want those conditions, the orbital period will be of 9.8 hours, and the transit duration of an Earth-like planet around this specific white dwarf will only last 2.2 minutes. So from 8 minutes that we have the giant planet, we go to 2.2 minutes. Now, the orbit, it's only almost 3 times the Roche radii, so it's also difficult to put a planet there without getting destroyed by tidal forces. But assuming that it doesn't get destroyed, you can model the atmosphere of the Earth, basically, or similar to the Earth. And this is what they did. They took several molecules present in Earth's atmosphere, and they did all the radiative transfer to get a transmission spectrum model and prediction, and to put it basically in the James Webb, and to see how long it would take to detect signals there from this hypothetical Earth. So what they found is, using a lot of spectral modeling and spectral retrieval, is that with the only 25 transit observations with James Webb near spec, you can detect a lot of molecules. You can detect water, you can detect carbon dioxide, And more importantly, you can detect ozone and other biosignatures that we call. Now, as you can see here, this is in the line is the retrieve model, and the points are the model observations. So, and this is only using 25 transits, but you might consider that if you have a 2.2 minute, a 2-minute transit, you can do a lot of observations, but I think the minimum observing time with the James Webb will be 1 to 1.5 hours. So a program to do this, it will take some time, some telescope time, but much less than what will you take to detect something around the best transiting planets around M dwarfs. So this is also another nice plot that they have in this paper of the number of hours that you require to detect different molecules. And you can see that with a couple of transits, with 3 you already detect water and carbon dioxide, but detecting more some what we call biosignatures like methane or ozone, it will take a lot of hours. But you can't do that now with the planets transiting M dwarf. So if there is a planet, a rocky planet orbiting around a white dwarf that we are able to observe, it's probably going to be our only chance to detect biosignatures. So this is one of the conclusions that they have in this paper. You can have a strong detection of water and carbon dioxide with 5 transits, some biosignatures only with 25 transits. And more importantly, you can compute atmospheric abundances with only 25 transits. Now, molecular oxygen and molecular nitrogen, it's more complicated. It will take 100 transits to detect with a 5 sigma precision. But these numbers are basically the best we could get using James Webb. You will need another generation of probably of instruments to detect these same signatures or in transited planets orbiting around M dwarfs. So this is the end of my talk. So I would like to point out some things to remember. So this is the WD 1856b is likely a planetary mass object. It needs confirmation, but it will be really rare that it is indeed a brown dwarf. To survive the whole star giant phase, this planet must have been formed further than 1 astronomical unit, and probably it get to this position with interacting with the additional planets in the system. So maybe it's a good thing to try to find these additional planets in this system. Now, from an atmosphere modeling point of view, so far planets around white dwarfs probably are the best opportunities to study atmospheres. Of course, we don't know how many planets are around white dwarfs that you can observe, and how many of these planets are in the habitable zone, but you can always dream. So using James Webb, you can detect molecules and biosignatures in rocky planets around white dwarfs, and also you can measure atmospheric abundances of rocky planets around white dwarfs. So so far, Gaia has detected close to 5,000 white dwarfs within 62 parsecs. So maybe if you're really lucky, there is a transited rocky planet waiting to be discovered. So thank you.
Okay, many thanks, Felipe, for this nice talk. That's very, very informative and very interesting on a topic that, is maybe not very well known to many of us. We will go to questions in a moment. I just like to mention something that I forgot to say before, and I've sent it in the chat, but maybe some of you don't see it. If there's any of you as a doctorando at the ULL, please identify yourself, be it in the chat or through an email to Seminarios, that you've participated in this talk here. And we will then sign this up. You still have to define a procedure how to do it, but at least it's known that you participated in this particular talk now. Okay, so any questions to the speaker? One moment, please. I have to turn off the, you can talk, just talk. I will unmute everyone. Let's see if we have noises in the system then. Everyone is unmuted right now, so if you have some background noise, no, it doesn't unmute anyone here. Yeah, I think you should be able to unmute yourself for questions. You can also raise hands. Let's see that, and request a question. You can also do it through the chat and ask for a question. So are there any questions or comments to Felipe's talk?
Okay. Maybe in the chat, no?
In the chat I'm checking, but I don't see anyone. Then, well, let me ask a question. Do you know or foresee any way to really confirm the mass of that whatever planet or low mass white brown dwarf? Is there something foreseeable that this could be done?
Well, without the Spitzer, I don't think so. I mean, it would be useful to have maybe more wavelengths, but observing the same transit, not the same, but several transits in different wavelengths to put further constraint. But you need to go to the infrared. Yeah. So without the Spitzer, so far I don't think so. And also, since it's faint and doesn't have lines, absorption lines, the white dwarf also anything to put constraint using real velocity measurements is hard. I think maybe we could do is to go to using, for example, EMIR, GTC EMIR, and try to get more really accurate or several transits, and then merge it with the optical data from GTC and maybe with the Spitzer. So that will help. As you saw, the transit in Spitzer is good, but if we could get something like this in using EMIR, and coupled with these observations, maybe you could further constrain the temperature. But I think you need to simulate before how many transits would you need. But this is the idea that I have, because the spectrum, there are no lines here. So because it's really old.
Yeah, we basically have no detection of the flux from the brown dwarf up to now in no wavelengths.
Yeah, the other thing that you could do is transmission spectroscopy, but for that I think you would need the James Webb telescope to try to detect any molecule that could be there in the atmosphere of the transiting object.
Which wouldn't give us a mass really either. It would give you a detection, but not the mass.
No, but I guess that's the only thing, or keep searching for another white dwarf with a 2-minute transit or 8-minute transit of some object there.
Okay.
I have a question about the same topic. Thanks for the nice talk. So, but you said that it might have reached to the current position by the interaction with other bodies. So, does it show any TTV signal?
As far as I know, not yet. but measuring the TTVs will be hard. It's not impossible, but since the transit is so short, you will need really good transit time resolution. But
because that can also tell us about the mass.
Yeah, that could be. It's also an idea that you could get. You could search for other objects in the system using TTVs. But yeah, you're right. That's also another thing that could constrain the mass. So far, there is only one sector with TESS, and I think they didn't detect any. But TESS has a really poor time resolution. So you will need something like Muscat 2 that can observe simultaneously in 4 bands. That helps to constrain the central time of the transit, or maybe GTC, but you can put a constraint of other objects in the system. Also, I didn't mention that the system is probably more complicated. I didn't mention this, but the white dwarf is probably a triple system. So you have the white dwarfs here and 2 M dwarfs that they have the same proper motion in the sky. So it's probably a triple system. So it's a triple star system. So to model all the interactions will be really hard, because you have also another object, two stars that probably they influence the possible other planets in this system during the giant phase. So these are the two M dwarfs that are probably belonging to a triple system, and this is the white dwarf here. So yeah, it's probably more complicated. The idea is that it's how to explain how it got to the current orbit, but it cannot be like only the white dwarf and this giant planet. Does not explain how it got there. So you need additional interactions.
Okay, thank you. Any further question? Last chance. Well, then let's thank the speaker again, and I'd just like to announce we have a talk in a week again. Right now, I don't remember the title, but at least we are back to attempting now to get back to our regular schedule. Okay, then thank you, and well, looking forward to see some of you again in next week's talk. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you to the
Bye-bye.
speaker. Bye.
Bye. See you.
Bye-bye. Thanks.